When I teach about homiletics, one of the things I say is that it's important for you to identify, first of all, what is the big idea or the main point that you want your people to take away from this sermon. So I think that the main point, the big idea that I want you to take away this morning from this message will be that our ability to trust increases exponentially when we give sacrificially to God until we get to the point where we are totally dependent upon Him. Now, I'm going to unpack that using a very familiar story in a few moments. The story of Elijah and then Elijah and the widow. You'll remember from the reading of the story a few moments ago that Elijah had just announced that there's going to be a great drought. And so people are already looking for basic food to stay alive. And yet Elijah has the audacity to ask this single mother to care for him as well as her family. In reality, it sounds rather disgusting. Sounds like a terrible thing to do, a terrible burden to put on this woman. But yet in reality, he's giving her the opportunity to give sacrificially to God and then to be able to stand back and see what God's going to do with those sacrificial gifts. You see, genuine giving puts God first and then trusts Him to supply our need. It develops our trust in God and not in our money or our other resources. As we look at this old story, I want to challenge you this morning to evaluate your giving and to ask yourself, is it real giving or is it pretend giving? Whenever you find genuine giving, you'll always find a history of God coming through with His abundant provision. I want to illustrate that by telling a story about the rice barrel in our first overseas appointment in Kingston, Jamaica, quite a few years ago. We lived in the heart of one of Kingston's major slum areas. And in that area, we serviced the community in so many different ways. We had a school, a children's school for children from ages 3 to 6. Here we would call it pre-primary or whatever. But there you had to attend school from 3 to 6. And then the staff worked very hard to make sure that you got into another school beyond that, got into primary school. We had 150 little children in our school, and we fed them a hot meal every day. For most of them, that would have been the only hot meal they would have gotten for the day. Upstairs, we had a daycare where we had 40 little children that we took care of while their parents went out to find some work during the daytime as well. In addition, we ran a seniors program where we had 40 to 50 seniors who would come. And in Jamaica in those days, there was no such thing as a pension for you. The older people just kind of eked out an existence whichever way they could. So they came to us and we gave them a hot meal and gave them some fellowship and a program. Well, all of that required a great deal of faith. And one of the things we would use an awful lot of was rice. We would get chicken back to make soup, to make a sauce to go over the rice, turkey back and neck, whatever was the cheapest meat we could possibly find, to add some flavor to this meal of rice. And we were totally dependent on external sources, international sources for that funding. And there were so many, many times when I would say to Lynette, I'm sorry, we've just scraped the bottom of the rice barrel. That's it. And for 4 years, the next day when I came back to that barrel, we always had rice to put in it. For 4 years, we completely depended upon God to make sure that the rice barrel never went dry. And when it went empty, there was always more to put in it the next day. And we thank God for those experiences. So many times, a check would come out of nowhere. Somebody would send a check and say, I don't know why, but God's laid you on my heart. Here's some money. Do what you want with it. And I go off and buy a bag of rice and pour into the barrel, and we'd be ready to start all over again. And we can tell you many other stories about our times in Africa where people had less than nothing by our standards, and yet they gave sacrificially to God. And they watched as God would stretch that nothing into something, at least enough to sustain them and their families, over and over again. And so in this story, God uses the drought to get King Ahaz's attention. And then he sends Elijah into the wilderness to hide because he doesn't think Ahaz is going to take this word very well. But in the wilderness, God provides for Elijah by sending ravens. And the ravens come to feed him. Now, if you know anything about ravens, we lived in Fort McMurray for 4 years, and up there we used to call the ravens black turkeys. It wasn't unusual at all to wake up in the morning to the sound of something scuffling and look out the window and see a raven dragging your garbage bag down the street. Ravens would take care of themselves. And so this is a tremendous reversal of the norm as God has the ravens bring the food to Elijah. There are two aspects to the story, of course, the miracle within the story. First, Elijah obeys. And secondly, God supplies. Now, you have to be moved by Elijah's obedience. A wilderness may be a great place to hide, but it's a tough place to survive. But yet, Elijah obeys. By the way, we're starting our Bible studies up again on Wednesday night, so come out and we're going to take a closer look at this particular story and the depth of Elijah's obedience. Without argument or question, he goes into the wilderness and puts himself in a place of total dependence on God because there's no one else out there to provide for him. God has to come through, and he does. He sends wild ravens every morning and every evening to feed his obedient leader. There's not only lots of food, there's gourmet food. Elijah gets meat. Imagine that. Did you catch that in the story? He gets meat. We were always so moved when we came to the very poor areas of our territory in Tanzania as their leaders. And our people would give us meat. We wouldn't take that for granted. Chicken, goat, sometimes beef. They would pool their resources and they would buy an animal. Most of the time they would want me to watch it being slaughtered, actually. And they would kill the animal and they would prepare the food because their territorial leaders were coming to visit. And I was always moved to tears over that because I knew just how sacrificial this gift was. You see, from day to day, they survived on maize and beans and a little rice. They couldn't afford to eat meat. But when their leader came to visit, they felt they had to get together, provide something a little more substantial, and provide something to honor their leader. Even when there wasn't a drought, meat was a luxury back in ancient Israel as well. Yet every morning, the ravens bring not only ordinary bread, but extraordinary meat to feed Elijah. And it was the same thing in the evening. This leader obeys God, and God comes through not only with food, but with gourmet food. But then even after such obedience and provision, we're told that the brook dries up and the need becomes great again. Elijah must have water. And this time God delivers for him, but with an even wilder instruction. And because of God's past supply, Elijah is ready to obey again. God tells him to leave the brook, go across Israel to a Gentile area, controlled, by the way, by the wicked king Ahaz. So God sends his leader into danger. But that's not all. He's told to go there and find a widow who was also one of the poorest people in the land. She's a single mother who's already overstressed trying to feed her family. He's supposed to look to her to feed him. Defies common sense, doesn't it? So why does he do it? Why does Elijah do it? He does it because of his personal history with God. He's just had this personal encounter with God where he's been fed by ravens and where he drinks from a brook in the middle of a drought. And that personal history gives him the confidence to give himself to God again and to obey God again. And so off he goes without option number 2 in his pocket. And I want to suggest to you that if you're going to become a genuine giver, a genuine servant of God, you've got to have a personal history with God to which you keep returning for encouragement and incentive to keep on going and to keep on giving. I thank God for the rich history of God's faithfulness, even in times when I doubted, and even in times when I wondered if he knew what he was doing. He always came through. I also want you to understand that there's a process involved in moving from flippant to genuine giving. And the story of Elijah and the woman illustrates that for us. And so I want to invite you to stay with me as we unpack that for a few moments. Trusting God to supply can be a terrifying thing. I don't want to pretend for a moment that we weren't scared when the rice barrel got low. But the story illustrates that the first step towards real giving is belief. The woman believed in the God of Israel long before she thought of giving her last meal to him. In her first conversation with Elijah, she utters a vow in the name of Israel's God. She says, "As surely as the Lord your God..." Now stop there. She lives adjacent to Israel, not in Israel, and she's not a Jew. Yet she believes that Israel's God is real and true and holy and present. She makes a declaration under his holy, watchful eye. In other words, she demonstrates belief in God. She knows that Elijah is an Israelite and that God is with him. God had won her heart before he made demands of her. Before God expects us to be genuine givers, genuine servants of his, he first of all wins our heart. That's where it all starts. Genuine giving, genuine service springs from genuine love. The second lesson we learn from this story is that we start with something small before we move to something great. When Elijah first meets the woman gathering sticks, I don't think he's quite sure that she's actually the one he's looking for. And so he asks for something simple first. "Give me a drink of water." Now, water is scarce because of the drought, but it's more plentiful than food. So he starts with a lesser need. And instead of ignoring him, this Gentile woman immediately goes off and fetches a drink for this foreigner. She knows he's a man of God, and she goes off to serve God by getting the servant of God a drink. It's always been a humbling experience for Lynette and I as we've served, especially in Africa, where they feel that if you come to visit and don't leave with a gift, then somehow they failed you. And it's always been very humbling to stand as they wrap you in this cloth, which is an expression of their love and appreciation for you, or give you a live chicken with a bag wrapped around the back end, of course, to make sure you don't soil your pristine white uniform. But all of these gifts are sacrificial gifts. And they give them to me not because of me, but because I'm their servant of God. And so it's been so humbling to, in so many ways, receive gifts that I know are being given to show their appreciation to God. A very moving experience. The third step in this lady's journey towards genuine giving, I think, is probably the greatest one of all. When she's on her way to get the water, Elijah calls out, "Oh, by the way, could I have some bread too?" Now, she didn't object about a drink of water, but now she's facing an incredible challenge. God knows I don't have much. In fact, I'm down to just a handful of barley flour and a little oil. I've just got enough for one more meal, and then my son and I will die." She must have been terrified at the prospect of doing what Elijah was asking her to do. Elijah's response teaches us something about the nature of genuine giving and service. In spite of her fear, he challenges her to give to God first and then wait for God to meet her need. Think about that for a moment. He knows how difficult this is for her, but because of his personal history in seeing God providing for him, he gives her the opportunity to enter into a similar history with God. "Go bake some bread, just as you were planning to do, but bring me some first. And then go make some for your family." He virtually pushes her toward genuine giving by reminding her of God's promise: your flour will not run out. Your oil will never run out throughout this drought. Others will struggle, but God will take care of you. Do you see the situation she's in now? Remember a few weeks ago, I reminded you that trust is risky business. She can trust what she sees and hold on to it, make a final meal for her family, and then die. Or she can do the courageous thing of trusting what she cannot yet see, believing the promise of God, giving her food away to God, believing that God will provide in a miraculous and abundant way. That's the challenge before her. Two choices. Do you understand? If we're going to become genuine givers, genuine servants of God, it's going to take a number of moves on our part. First of all, we have to give our hearts to God. Then we must learn to give to Him in smaller ways until we get to the point where we'll actually be ready to become radical in our giving to Him, where we're forced to depend upon Him to supply our needs. There's a process in becoming genuine in our giving, genuine in our service. But that's the kind of giving that unleashes God to provide in His own miraculous way. Our courageous giving opens the way for God to do amazing things. But when you read the story, don't miss the correlation between what Elijah did and what the woman did. Through their joint faith, God began to shine in that entire Gentile region. One of my challenges as territorial leader in Tanzania was to try to generate more income within the territory. It was a new territory, heavily subsidized by international headquarters, but we were constantly under pressure from international headquarters, try to generate income within the territory. Now, I would say about 95% of our people were subsistence farmers. How do you teach tithing to people who barely grow enough to eat? Well, you teach them that if you have 10 baskets of fruit from your tree, then one basket belongs to God. If you have 10 tomatoes that you harvested, then one tomato belongs to God and should joyfully be given to Him. Well, they hadn't heard that before. They hadn't understood that before. They'd only understood tithing in terms of money. And they didn't have money, so they felt they weren't obligated to tithe. Well, a wonderful thing began to happen shortly after that. The officers report that people came to their door with chickens, and they came with rice, and they came with corn, and they came with potatoes, the things that they had harvested from their field. Elijah is a leader who comes to a destitute woman and challenges her to give in a courageous way. Now, that must have been a very difficult thing for him to do as a leader. But he knew that God would provide. And so he leads by calling her to give, knowing that God will come in on the backside and provide what she needed and reveal himself to her. And then she does something too. She courageously gives. She goes off and bakes and takes the first bread to the man of God, believing that God will provide for her and her family. Have you ever looked at the results of that? First of all, the man of God, Elijah, has food to eat every day. Now that's a great provision of God. This was not a safe place for him to be in Ahaz's backyard. He's trying to call the Israelites themselves back from their terrible idolatry. But if he's going to hang in there and do that, he's got to eat. He's got to be sustained. So for 12 to 18 months, if you read the narrative carefully, you find that God takes care of his needs through an impoverished single mother. God provides. Now here's the second great result, though. The woman and her son also have enough food to eat all the way through the drought. Remember, she was down to her last handful of barley flour and a little oil. But her and her son are sustained throughout the drought. In ancient lands like this, every widow was poor by definition. A widow had no one to provide for her, no one to protect her. They were always terribly poor. But this woman and her son were just on the brink of death because the drought was hitting them so hard. She was more than destitute. She obeys, and every day for 12 to 18 months, her food supply triples. She has enough for him, enough for her family, and enough the next day to start all over again. God supplied for her as well as for his own man. Did you notice that God's abundance didn't come because a woman hoarded what she had, but spent what she had? That's an amazing principle. God didn't supply needs because a woman hoarded what she had. He supplied needs because she spent what she had by giving it. She gave in response to Elijah's challenge, and God provided in abundant, miraculous ways. Now, this story, unfortunately, appears to end on a tragic note. But really, it ends on a note of more giving and more faith. Even the most courageous givers are not exempt from tragedy. It was a few months later that the widow's son dies. She thought it was because of some sin in her life. That was the dominant thought in those days. But Elijah thought, this isn't due to sin. He viewed it as an opportunity for God's glory to shine even brighter in that Gentile nation. He took the boy up to his room. He cried out to God with amazing honesty. He takes God to the task, much like the psalmists do. Remember, we talked about that? He said, wait a minute, God. You saved this boy from starving, and then you let him die? Come on. And then he prayed fervently. Scripture says, stretching his body over the lifeless body of the boy and asking God to restore him to life. And God, for the very first time in the Old Testament record, brings somebody back to life again. Why? The closing sentence of the chapter tells us why. Listen. Then the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is truth. God did this miracle of raising the boy back to life to deepen her faith and to touch that entire Gentile region with the glory of his provision. This word would have gone viral, maybe even on Facebook. Would have gotten out there quickly. How God had provided for someone who had deeply trusted him. She began by giving her flour and oil to God, and God provided. Now she gives her dead son to God, and God brings him back to life again. Now I'm confident, because of the miracle of the flour and the oil multiplying, I'm confident that this lady had enough faith in God that would last her whole lifetime. It probably would have gotten her through the terrible loss of her son if he hadn't been raised again. But God touched her and made her a witness to the entire region. And so the primary goal of genuine giving, the primary goal of genuine serving, is trust in God that takes you deeper and deeper and deeper. That's the real goal of real giving and real serving, that we would come to trust God even more. But what is genuine giving? I think it's giving to God in a way that causes us to become more dependent upon Him. So when you're afraid, realize that the only way to have enough is to give courageously to God. Understand that real giving comes in steps. Give a little as He asks, then grow to the point of giving to Him sacrificially and radically. Don't be afraid. Trust God to supply, and this week, this month, this year, take a step to becoming a genuine giver, a genuine server of God, a genuine servant. Giving is such an act of worship. I hope you realize that when the collection plate comes around on Sunday morning. It's not just giving something so that you don't look bad when the plate goes by. Giving is an act of worship. And I'm challenging you in this coming year to make it a sacrificial act of worship. Because as a core, we need you to continue giving, but we also need you to continue serving. I was amazed when we sat down with Jory this past week and looked at all of the people who had come on stream this past year and what they were doing for the Lord. There's still so much more to be done. And there's still so many places that need to be filled. And so I want to challenge you this morning to commit yourself at the beginning of this year to be one of those persons who says, I'm going to give more. I'm going to serve more. I want to see God do more in my life. And the more I sacrifice, the more I give, the more I serve, the more I know of Him as well. I want to challenge you to say, I'm going to aim to be radical in both my giving and my serving in this coming year. I'm going to give sacrificially. I'm going to serve sacrificially. And I'm going to be amazed at what God's going to do. I'm not suggesting you can buy God. I'm not saying that at all. First of all, you give Him your heart. And when you give Him your heart, you can't leave your wallet at home. You can't give Him your heart and keep everything else that He's given to you. You have to recognize that I can serve God by my giving, and I can serve God by my doing. I can come alongside and say, what needs to be done? Is there a place for me? Is there something I can do? In fact, I'm going to do something a little different this morning in our service. We're going to sing Song 591, it's I Would Be Thy Holy Temple. And I'm going to say to you this morning, if you want to make a commitment that you want to do more for God this year, I want you to stand where you are, or come and kneel, or come and stand, and say, I don't know what God's asking me to do yet. I don't have my head around it yet. I just feel deep within me that God wants me to do more. I'm not sure what that more is. I'm not sure what the needs of the core are at this point in time. But I feel God moving in my heart, and I feel God saying to me, you can do more. And I want to commit myself this morning that I'm going to do more for God in this coming year. And we'll pray with you. And then perhaps we'll have a meeting with you, and we'll talk, and we'll try to identify together how it is you can serve God more sacrificially. Serve God more thoroughly. Serve God to the point where you're feeling that, yes, I'm doing what God wants me to be doing. I'm serving Him well. So as we sing together, I'm just going to say to you, we have a place of prayer here. It's a place where you can come and you can offer yourself to God. And you can say to Him again, I've loved you, I've served you for many years. You have my heart. but there are other things in my life perhaps that you don't have. And I just want you to speak to my heart this morning. I just want you to reveal to me what it is you want me to be doing with this life that you've given to me, with these resources that you've given to me, with these talents that you've given to me, with these natural abilities that you've given to me. What exactly do you want me to be doing with them? Some of you may even be feeling a sense of calling to full-time service as an officer. At the beginning of this year, commit yourself to having your eyes wide open, to seeing what God is doing in your life and what God could be doing in your life if you gave him the whole of your life. So as we sing softly together, let's just make these moments of prayer, moments of commitment, moments of surrender as God speaks to your heart. God bless you.